Welcome to the 28storms.com tropical weather update for Monday, August 1st. The main focus continues to be 91L Invest as it begins to enter the Lesser Antilles. I've been thinking for the last 36 hours that this was on the cusp of becoming a tropical depression, and it is still fairly close, but every single time it looks like it's about to become a tropical cyclone, we get another visible image, and sure enough, the low and mid-level circulations are not vertically stacked, meaning that we still have a bit too much of disorganization for this thing to really develop. And the Hurricane Center has lowered their 2-day probabilities of development from 100% to 80%, but nevertheless that's still fairly high. And despite the more slow development that I did not anticipate, I still think that we will eventually get a tropical depression and more than likely Tropical Storm Emily from this invest. Looks can be really deceiving when you look from a more regional view. This would give you the impression that we have a developing tropical storm just east of the Caribbean, and the infrared doesn't even look all that bad with some sporadic convection near the center, although it is a little bit elongated here from the southeast Caribbean well into the central Atlantic. And also on the water vapor imagery, the current upper level appearance of the atmosphere doesn't look to be all that inhibiting. We see that there is a fairly good mid to upper level ridge located over the tropical low pressure area. There may be some slight westerly wind shear, especially along the northern half, closer to the Leeward Islands, but that's certainly not enough to really hinder this development. And overall, this looks like a fairly favorable pattern with no upper-level lows really squashing the system like we saw in the Gulf of Mexico with Tropical Storm Don. And by using the Sims wind shear analysis, we can see that the wind shear values are in excess of about 30 to 35 knots across 20 degrees north latitude, but that is just to the north of the center, and as long as this remains on a general west to west-northwest track over the next 48 hours, that shouldn't be a problem. In fact, this should only help to ventilate the poleward outflow channel, and so overall, upper-level conditions along with sea surface temperatures continue to support slow development as this begins to move into the eastern Caribbean. And this is just another look at things. Here's the tropical low pressure area with an upper level ridge located directly over it. So once again, that's a favorable pattern. If you look at the latest 850 millibar vorticity analysis, if you compare this to the last 2 days, yesterday and the day before, we saw that this vorticity max was elongated from east to west. And this afternoon, we're beginning to see more of a concentration here, almost directly over the Lesser Antilles, and I want you to keep that in mind when we start to look at a more zoomed-in visible image. Also, if we look at some of the low-level convergence values, we see that some of the greatest convergence, where air is piling up near the surface, it's greatly occurring the most here near Barbados, as the system as a whole begins to work its way into the Lesser Antilles. Now, here's the latest visible animation, and it's quite a mess, but there are a couple key things I would like to point out. First off, this is the main circulation that is still being tracked by the Hurricane Center. When they give a position estimate of 91L Invest as a whole, they're still tracking this mid-level circulation. But if you compare that to the 850 millibar vorticity analysis, that SIMS chart would seem to suggest that this is steadily beginning to possibly weaken. And also, if we look off toward the west here, it's not overly strong just yet, but we are seeing some low-level banding and the possibility of a low-level circulation trying to work its way down to the surface. Now, it's not going to be able to do that completely until we have more convection develop over it, although within the last 3 to 6 hours, we have seen a bit more of an increase along the eastern semicircle of that low-level circulation. And also, we still have some convection remaining here just to the southwest of it. And it will be interesting to see if overnight that we begin to see more convection begin to cluster around this potential developing center. And also, if we look at some of the latest surface observations, you will find that some of the islands, including Dominica, are reporting very light westerly winds. Now, to be a little bit more definitive, we would like those winds to be a little bit stronger than they are. As of right now, they're only reporting westerly winds less than 5 knots. But you can sort of assume that that is some evidence here that these westerly winds would indicate that we have a developing low-level circulation here just to the north. So that'll be interesting to see what happens. And as of 3 o'clock Eastern Time, we're still monitoring the recon flight, and they flew out of the Lesser Antilles several hours ago. They made it all the way to almost 57 degrees west longitude, but now they're beginning to turn back around, and I highly suspect that they're beginning to investigate that low-level circulation that we noted near Dominica. Now, as I've been talking about the last 3 days, getting the intensity forecast right is highly critical when it comes time to produce an accurate forecast track. And the intensity, of course, is now a lot more up in the air. There are several models that do develop this, but there's also several models that really don't show much in the way of development over the next 72 to 96 hours. And partly the reason why we're beginning to see more of a shift toward the west in the model tracks is because the system has not really developed much over the last 36 hours. And so that means it's more prone to missing any troughs over the central and western Atlantic, as it remains generally weak and could possibly slide underneath for an extended period of time. So if we look at the latest tropical model plots, several of these models are now taking this much closer to the Florida Peninsula, and quite frankly, this could be anywhere from the lower Florida Keys all the way to the Bahamas in the 4 to 5 day range, because not only do we have intensity as a big question mark, but we'll make that even more questionable is if this decides to track directly over Hispaniola, and the odds of that happening have increased a bit more today. And as we've discussed already in these videos, if this goes over Hispaniola, that's going to really mess up the forecast models. There's going to be more than likely a bit more track divergence if it moves over here, and by the time it gets into the southeast Bahamas, we would just have to evaluate the storm's current intensity, and then we'll have to take a closer look at the more dominant steering pattern based on that storm's intensity. Now, for the last 48 hours, I've been telling all interest in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico to be on guard, as it looked like there was a very high probability of the storm passing directly over you. If you couldn't tell on the spaghetti model plots, it looks like there's been a significant shift to the south and west of you over the last 12 hours. That's not to say the models can't shift back more toward the north. As we've seen, the models are really fickle and they're going back and forth right now. So even though there's probably a higher chance of this going more toward Hispaniola, I would still advise you to keep a close watch on the weather over the next 24 to 48 hours. Now, if we start to look at the 12Z Canadian CMC model forecast, we see that over the next 24 hours, it takes our developing 91L invest into the Eastern Caribbean, and here we go with the more western model tracks again. It now shows this system paralleling much of the greater Antilles, and now between the day 4 and day 5 range, it takes this developing system into the Florida Keys. And believe it or not, the CMC is the first model to really take this into the eastern Gulf of Mexico, and by day 6, it's sitting just to the south of Apalachicola. Again, this is the westernmost model right now, so I would still say that the consensus is more so over the Florida Peninsula and the Bahamas. But again, there's a lot of time for this to swing back and forth from west to east in the day to 5 to 6 range. Now we're looking at the 12Z GFS. We see that the trough is still persistent here over the West Atlantic for at least the first 96 hours. That's strong enough to at least lower the system over Hispaniola and into the extreme southern Bahamas along with the Florida Peninsula within about the next 5 days. And then you really can't see it so much on this chart, but there's enough ridging here over the western Atlantic, and then there's also still enough of a shortwave trough over the Appalachians that would be enough to pull this north from the Florida Keys and have it parallel up the Florida Peninsula. And the 12Z ECMWF is very similar to the GFS. It's really not showing that much in the way of development, but if you notice the first 24 to 72 hours, it does strengthen the 850 millibar vorticity max associated with the invest. And here we are by 48 and then 72 hours. It actually passes just to the south of most of Hispaniola. By 72 hours, it's beginning to approach Haiti. By 96 hours, it's still over some very serious terrain of eastern Cuba. Again, much of Hispaniola and extreme eastern Cuba is highly mountainous, and tropical cyclones don't like that type of terrain. But much like the GFS, by day 5, it's beginning to work its way into the Florida Keys, and then by day 6, it's moving due north over the Florida Peninsula as it still begins to feel a slight weakness over the Carolinas. So as of 3:20 Eastern Time, I'm still looking at the reconnaissance data. They still haven't found any sign of a westerly wind as they begin to approach Dominica, so this system probably still has a ways to go before it becomes a classified tropical depression. And then of course we still have a few models that aren't even showing development. So to sum things up, I still think that we will get a tropical depression and more than likely Tropical Storm Emily of this, but the Lesser Antilles won't have to worry about a classified cyclone passing through. But the overall conditions will be the same. Over the next 12 hours, you will be experiencing a lot of heavy rain in those isolated bands with wind gusts exceeding tropical storm force. And then as this gets into the Caribbean, it very well could become our next tropical cyclone of the season. And then we'll just have to see what happens after it begins to cross through Hispaniola and eastern Cuba. One thing that is more confident, though, one thing we are more confident about, is that since this hasn't developed over the last 36 hours, it will pass a lot closer to the southeast United States. Now, in terms of what intensity it will be at its closest approach, or if it makes landfall, Well, that is still to be determined. Again, there's just a lot of question marks today, and hopefully things will become a little bit more definitive as we work our way into Tuesday. But thanks again for visiting 28storms.com. We'll have more updates on our Facebook page along with the website, so check back soon.